In the article, published in the International Journal of Sports Medicine, titled Variation in Responses to Sprint Training in Male Youth Athletes, Jason Moran and colleagues conducted a meta-analysis to explore how sprint training affects athletes at 3 different stages of growth. Ages 10 to 12 were considered pre-peak height velocity, ages 13 to 15 were considered mid-peak height velocity, and 16 to 18 were considered post-peak height velocity. Although these categories are based on chronological age, they do align with key biological growth patterns. The mid-peak height velocity stage corresponds with the interval of maximal growth in males of North American and European descent, and around age 14 is a crucial period for training-related physiological development. By age 15, most boys have reached 94% of their adult height. While biological maturity varies greatly, differences tend to level off after age 16, which is why this was considered the post-peak height velocity phase. So how does sprint training impact young athletes at each stage? This is Talking Sports Science with a summary of their article. Firstly, regarding the study criteria, studies were only included in the analysis if the sprint training lasted between 4 and 16 weeks, involved healthy males aged 10 to 18 who were engaged in organised sports. The training intervention group had to include sprinting movements, with recovery after each effort, with an aim to improve sprint performance, and a control group for comparison. Studies that involve resisted or repeated sprint training were excluded. In the end, 14 studies met the criteria. 11 included soccer players, 2 had basketball players, and 1 study involved handball players. In terms of biological maturity, 2 studies focused on pre-pubertal children, 5 in mid-pubertal, and 7 on post-pubertal athletes. And here is the characteristics of the male youth athletes from the sprint training studies included in the analysis. And here is the mean training characteristics of the programs completed by the youth athletes from the 14 studies reviewed. The pre and post groups had similar total training loads, whereas the mid group had a substantially higher volume of training compared to both the pre or post groups. These factors will be taken into account when reviewing the findings. And moving on to the findings, the analysis revealed sprint training does improve sprint performance, but the effects vary depending on maturity level. Mid-peak height velocity athletes saw moderate improvements in sprint performance. Post-peak height velocity athletes experienced large improvements in sprint performance, while pre-peak height velocity athletes showed little to no improvement. However, as only 2 studies focused on this group, more research is needed to be sure. As mentioned previously, one factor to consider when interpreting the results is the mean training load across the maturity groups. The pre- and post-peak height velocity groups had largely similar training loads when measured by total distances sprinted and total sessions per program, yet they adapted differently. The post-peak height velocity athletes performed fewer sprints per session, but at nearly double the distance of the pre-peak height velocity group, indicating that a lower volume of sprints over a longer distance may be more effective training protocol in youth athletes. The mid-peak height velocity group had the highest training volume of the groups. This could mean they require a sprint training stimulus of greater duration or magnitude to realise the benefits of training. Nevertheless, the effectiveness of sprint training appears to increase as youth athletes mature. Based off the findings, programs lasting 8 weeks, consisting of up to 2 sprint sessions each week, involving up to 16 sprints, with each sprint around 20 metres, is suggested to enhance sprint performance in youth athletes. And at least 90 seconds of rest, or a 1 to 25 work to rest ratio, is recommended to ensure full recovery. This approach allows athletes to train at max intensity while maintaining good sprint mechanics. However, these recommendations are general guidelines that may need to be adjusted based on the maturity status of the athlete. For example, when trainability is lower, like before their peak height velocity, it's suggested to focus on fundamental movements, like running, skipping, jumping and balancing, which can be combined with exercises that improve strike frequency, like assisted or downhill sprints, for the more advanced athletes. Also, fast leg drills and bounding movements can be used to improve sprint mechanics. During and after peak height velocity, when sprint training becomes more effective, training can be more focused to improve strength and sprinting performance. Ultimately, a multimodal approach, combining sprint training with complementary exercises will maximise sprint performance throughout youth development. And that concludes this summary of the variation in responses to sprint training in male youth athletes. As always, I recommend you go and check out the full article. The link is in the description. Thanks for watching, folks. See you next time.